Christian Mu is an independent writer, translator and researcher based in Slovenia, originally from Norway. He's done research on Islam, human rights and religious affairs in the Balkans and consulted on religion and foreign policy. He's a co-editor of the Yearbook of Muslims in Europe, published by Brill, 2 books on religion and representation in the former Yugoslavia, and also 3 different volumes of the New Directions in Islamic Thought, a project which is part of the Oslo Coalition on Freedom of Religion or Belief, a program of the Norwegian Center for Human Rights. The most recent volume of this project, also co-edited by Mu, was published this year with the title Freedom of Expression in Islam, Challenging Apostasy and Blasphemy Laws. Now, before we dive into this main topic of our today's conversation, the apostasy and blasphemy laws in modern Islamic countries, could you please give us a brief introduction to the specific Norwegian and European context also in which this New Directions project and the Oslo Coalition program were established? Why is the interpretation of Islam and dialogue with Islamic scholars so important to the modern Norwegian society? And what are some of the main challenges that the increasing presence of Islamic population in recent decades poses to Norway and also, of course, to the wider Scandinavian and European societies?
Mm-hmm. So, to begin with, the framework of this project, the Oslo Coalition program, is it came out of the new realization that culture and religion was playing a role in international affairs, and Norwegian authorities at the end of the 1990s wanted to do something in the field of religion and international politics, so they held a big conference in Oslo on freedom of religion. And the Oslo Coalition, which I work with, came out of that. It's a coalition of academics and believers and non-believers and advocates who work to advance the cause of freedom of religion globally. And it is based at the University of Oslo at the Center for Human Rights. And we work in ways that are perhaps not so noticeable. We produce materials like this book, for example. We do in-depth studies. We discuss, for example, how religious education or missionary work should be regulated and how it should not. So within that framework, we have a working group on new directions in Islamic thought. And although the Oslo Coalition is focused on freedom of religion, we take a large view of it. So we have addressed various human rights questions in our 3 books to date. The second book, for example, was all about gender equality in family law. And this Islam project came out of a workshop we had in Oslo in 2003. I have to explain also that many of us working with the Oslo Coalition are academics who study religion. And this project actually came out of a workshop at the university where we were looking at Islamic law. And it just so happened that we had some visiting lecturers, Fikret Karcic from Bosnia-Herzegovina and Zibamir Hosseini from the UK, who hit it off very well, and we decided that together we could make a project. We could bring together Muslim scholars interested in various human rights issues, interested in progressive interpretations of Islam, and produce some new knowledge about Islam and human rights. So here we are, 3 books and a lot of workshops around the world later. So this comes out of, so this is a project funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, based at the University of Oslo, and driven by the interests of the participants, partly those such as myself who study the history of religion or related topics, and are coming at Islam from that angle, the academic angle, partly driven by the interests of, essentially driven by the interests, of course, of the Muslim scholars who contribute. So in these 3 books, our principle has been to collect contributions by people working within the Islamic tradition. These are not written from outside by, for example, myself as a researcher. They are written by people who take the Islamic tradition seriously, who come from that place, and who address problems they see in their own traditions, meeting with modernity and with the new norms of human rights. So that we're based in Norway is partly a coincidence and partly not. We have a certain tradition of studies in the history of religion. We have a certain interest from the government in religious diplomacy or in the religious aspect of international affairs. We have, like other Western European countries, a number of Muslim citizens, as elsewhere, a result mostly of labor immigration from the end of the 1960s, partly also as a result of refugees fleeing wars. For example, we have a sizable Bosnian community in Norway due to the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So these are also issues that are debated, of course, in the Norwegian society.
Yeah, but what was the main motive for the establishment of the Oslo coalition? It probably has to do with certain developments in the Norwegian society, right? Or do you think it's independent of that?
So it's partly independent of developments to do with Islam, really. Globally, in academia and in politics and in diplomacy, there was a turn at that time towards taking religion seriously. Books were published with titles such as Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. And we also happened to have individuals in government who had a personal relationship with religion and had a religious network in other countries that they were able to draw on. So they took these issues seriously. They took religious freedom seriously, and they wanted to do something. And then it was institutionalized. But this was also at the time where this was also at the time of a shift in the Norwegian debate, which had very much to do with immigration and Islam. Basically, Norway became a very rich country in the last quarter of the 20th century. So we needed workers to build our growing oil economy. So people came from Pakistan, from Turkey, and like other countries, we sort of didn't think about what would happen next. They were generally expected to come there, do their jobs, and then go back again, which they didn't. So now their children and their children's children are Norwegian. And there are frictions, of course. And in the middle of the 1990s, there was a shift from a very superficial sort of multiculturalism, where the governing idea was that as long as we are all not racist and can all get along, everything will work itself out. And then a lot of critical questions started to be asked, whether the Norwegian state was in fact neglecting its own children, girls raised in strict traditional religious families, children sent back to the countries of origin for schooling. There were questions over female genital mutilation connected with immigrants from certain countries in Africa, and so on. So this was
in the 90s, you said?
This was in the 90s, this shift. So these questions related to immigration, immigrant cultures, and Islam were being raised in new ways. And then, of course, in connection with the topic of blasphemy, which is part of the topic of this book, when we get to 2005, 2006, there was a quite traumatic event for Scandinavians, for Danes and Norwegians, when the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten published a collection of caricatures, cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. And this caused a great deal of conflict. There were riots against Denmark, and then after a Norwegian newspaper reprinted these cartoons against Norway in various places in the Middle East. Consulates were burned in Damascus. This was a quite challenging and traumatic event for Norwegian society. For Denmark even more. They were in the eye of the storm, but we also got quite a bit of the spillover. So at this time, the question of a conflict between Islam and freedom of expression was being raised a great deal, and freedom of expression was being held out as a very central value of our society that had to be defended at all costs and that everyone had to show loyalty towards. And so the loyalty of Muslim citizens to our core values was being increasingly questioned.
So what were the main consequences of this discussion on the freedom of expression?
Well, that's a good question. Well, for one thing, we got rid of our blasphemy law, finally. And that is perhaps a topic we can return to, the issue of Western blasphemy laws.
In 2006, 7, when was it?
No, it was later.
Even later.
I don't actually remember the year. But at this point, we still had a blasphemy law. So did Denmark. And I mean, if you think back even further, when we're discussing Islam and blasphemy, to the Salman Rushdie case in the 1980s and 90s, England has a blasphemy law, but it only protects Christians. It only protects the Church of England. And this double standard, this hypocritical approach, is something that has always been a part of the debate that has been raised by Muslim citizens. It was raised in the Salman Rushdie case, the Satanic Verses case in the 1980s, but the courts did not agree that the law had to protect Muslims against blasphemy as well. So in Scandinavia, we hung on to our blasphemy laws, although they were mainly they were dead articles on paper. In Norway, they had not been used since the 1920s, when we last had a trial for blasphemy against one of our most famous poets, who had held a very provocative lecture about Christianity, against Christianity. That was the last time. After that, everyone agreed that it was just silly to prosecute people for blasphemy, but
it was still
the
in
law
place.
stayed on the books and continued to represent a value of Norwegian society. And since we're talking about Norwegian society, I should probably explain that until just a couple of years ago, Norway had a state church. The religion of the Norwegian state was Lutheran Protestantism. And this had constitutional consequences. The king and half of the ministers of the government had to be members of the state church. Priests were public officials. They were public employees. There was religious instruction in schools until the 1990s. And after the 1990s, we had a kind of hybrid school subject that still had certain elements of Christian religious instruction, which caused no end of problems. So until quite recently...
when did it end?
It was a process from around 2012 to around 2018. And what used to be the Norwegian State Church and is now supposedly the Norwegian People's Church still has a special position in Norwegian society. But at the same time, Norway has quite generously funded all other religions, or other religious communities, organized religious communities as well. Based on membership, they would receive per head the same as the Norwegian State Church did in public funding. So that is also an aspect. But then we held on to the blasphemy law, and there was quite an ethos in public broadcasting, for example, that there should not be programming that offended Christian sensibilities. These things started to change in the 1980s with cable television, and I mean, we couldn't police the public sphere anymore the way we used to, but what I'm trying to get at is that there has been quite a lot of restrictions on religion and on speech in Norway historically. And we are not the only Western European country with that kind of history. And there is also a history of blasphemy cases even before the European Court of Human Rights, affirming that states can limit the freedom of expression to protect the religious feelings of believers. So one thing that was puzzling in the Norwegian debate, I think, for me, was this sudden insistence on the absolute value of a freedom of expression. All this sudden quoting of a Voltaire, because this was
not responding to the past of the country.
This was not really what our history had been, and also what was being said about freedom of expression as a human right in this context. It didn't really accord with what the authorities on the human right to freedom of expression and religion, what they were saying. It's very funny. I don't think anybody really remarked on it at the time, but just in 2005, just before the Danish cartoon affair, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that it might be necessary in a democratic society to confiscate a book, a novel, that said some questionable things about the Prophet Muhammad, and to fine the author. That was a Turkish case that reached the European Court of Human Rights.
That was before the affair with the cartoons?
Yes, the same year.
The same year.
Nobody remarked on that at the time, I think, but there we have the European Court of Human Rights actually saying, okay, you can, the state can legitimately restrict criticism, even art, presenting the Prophet of Islam in a bad light. And at the same time, we had this Scandinavian debate in which this was unimaginable, because it seemed obvious to everybody that the freedom of expression meant Muslims would just have to
So you think that
accept.
Here the Scandinavian, wider Scandinavian view on this issue kind of prevailed also in Norway and...
Well, there's not one Scandinavian view either. I mean, for decades now, in the Norwegian debate, Danish public debate has been considered very anti-immigrant, very confrontational, rather racist. At the same time, the Swedes have considered Norwegians rather nationalistic, and they were worrying about the kind of thing that Norwegians were saying about immigrants, the same way we were worrying about the Swedes. So it's not a monolith up there either.
And also, of course, in Norway, there's a very broad spectrum of attitudes towards Islam. On one side of this spectrum, the extremely positive side, there are around 3,000 Norwegian converts to Islam in recent years, if I'm not mistaken. I saw this in some statistics, I think from academic of the University in Oslo in recent years. And then there is also, of course, this wider general population where attitudes probably range from enthusiastic and tolerant to, of course, a bit more critical, skeptical, and also, of course, also some very negative. And then there is also, on this side of the spectrum, there is also quite strong and visible far-right movement, which is, of course, characterized by an aggressive anti-Muslim sentiment, not just in Norway, but right now all across Europe. So, what is, in your view, a prevalent Norwegian attitude towards Islamic minority and Islamic religion, and also what are maybe some of the Norwegian specific characteristics in this wider spectrum of different attitudes towards Islam, maybe when you're comparing Norway to other Scandinavian countries or other European countries?
This is a big question that I'm not really sure how to address. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, for example, as I mentioned, we have state financing of a variety of Muslim religious communities, and we have a reasonably strong culture, not only of freedom of expression, but also of freedom of religion. There is multiculturalism remains an approach. For example, Norway is not one of those countries that goes around banning Muslim dress in public places, although actually in recent years there have been restrictions on face covering in educational institutions. But mostly this is something we have tried to solve as flexibly and as locally as possible, and basically upheld the right to Muslim dress, for example, in employment situations and so on. But like I said, starting in the mid-1990s, I think there has been a constant concern, that Muslims, various immigrant groups sometimes, but Muslims as such, that they in some way constitute a problem population, that their loyalty to Norwegian norms and values is somehow in doubt, and that we have to have programs to make sure they are integrated into Norwegian society. Of course, integration is a big debate everywhere. In Norway in recent years, there has been talk, for example, about a range of measures to emancipate people from social pressures of their community. But this discussion again has not gone as far as in Denmark, for example. And then there is the other thing that you mentioned. For the past 10 years exactly, the Norwegian discussion has also been has also taken place in the realization that far-right Islamophobia is a dangerous thing.
By sheer coincidence, we're having this conversation exactly on the 10th anniversary of one of the most horrible crimes in the Norwegian history. Actually, the deadliest act of violence in Norway since the Second World War. The 2011 attacks in which Anders Breivik murdered almost 80 people, mostly teenagers. He tried to justify this crime with a manifesto, which was mainly influenced by the anti-Islamic ideology of the far-right movements. I saw some news recently that there were some disputes in Norway about how to respectfully approach this anniversary. How does Norwegian society reflect on this national tragedy 10 years after? And did this tragedy have any visible influence on the attitudes toward Islam and also the critics, of course, of Islam in the recent decade?
Yes, and my impression is that they got louder and became more prominent in the debate than they had so far, which is a paradox. You would expect when a far-right Islamophobe kills scores of children, you would expect a society to sort of, go into a war on terror against that kind of ideology. But this was not what happened. On the very evening of that tragic event, the Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg, who is now the Secretary General of NATO, but he was then Prime Minister, and the leader of the party, whose youth organization was the target of the killings on Utøya. In the midst of this personal tragedy also for him, he said that we are not going to let the terrorists win, we are going to meet this with more openness, more democracy, but not with naivete. So that was the chord that was struck from the beginning, which was, a great response. But it was a strange debate that followed. And I think that actually in the past week, I've seen a lot of signs that this debate is now turning around. Because the survivors from the Social Democratic Youth Organization have often been criticized and shouted down in public debate when they referred to their experience to warn against the spread of far-right hatred and Islamophobia. They've been criticized for playing the massacre card, they have been accused of trying to silence their political opponents with this. Whereas the people who were going on about Islam posing a danger to European civilization and to Norway and so on before the event went on doing so afterward. The blogger who the terrorist quoted most frequently in his manifesto, a Norwegian blogger, got a grant to write a book.
A national grant?
From a foundation set up to support free expression. They support a lot of things, including this. We have a blog, another blog. It used to be a kind of advocacy group for women from the Muslim community, but it's turned into a very anti-immigrant, anti-Islam propaganda outlet. It gets state funding and so on. And but in this last week, I see a lot of people in the Norwegian public conversation revising their stances and saying that we have given too much of a platform to the ideologies that motivated the terrorists, and too little of a platform to the victims. But it's a strange and sort of paradoxical development, I think. Certainly in line with the principle of more democracy, more openness, we did not clamp down on far-right speech after this. But I think we also failed as a society to confront it, to speak against it. If the Islamophobes got a platform, then to answer them, to rebut them, well, I could go on, but... And a lot of people have also remarked, well, if you look back at the cartoon incident in 2006, this was, in the following years, a lot of young Muslim people who had grown up in Norway entered the public debate for the first time. Before that, there were very few people in the Norwegian public speaking from a Muslim viewpoint. There were spokesmen here and there, but since the early 2000s, we have had a new generation of young intellectuals who take part in the debate. But a lot of people have remarked on this the last week that they have that Muslims have not been as much part of the debate after the terrorist attack as one might have expected. Perhaps they are afraid. Perhaps they find it a difficult discussion to enter into, so that we have these problems of how do we balance all these things, the freedom of expression, and at the same time the need to have a national conversation where Muslim citizens feel at home, where the victims of the attacks feel that they can speak out, where we don't meet the haters with legal restrictions necessarily, but where we certainly meet them as a society, speaking back, calling them out. So I'm hopeful that perhaps we're seeing a shift there now.
Let's maybe just outline the basic structure of this project. What exactly is the status of blasphemy and apostasy laws right now in the world? You've mentioned that even some Western countries recently had them, or maybe some even have some remains in place. And also there are some countries outside of Muslim world which still have active blasphemy laws. I think Russia is probably the most known example, but the apostasy laws are very much a Muslim phenomenon. So
exactly. So again, some Western countries still have blasphemy laws, and others, like Norway, have had them until quite recently. And this is there's even a tradition of human rights decisions that say you can prosecute blasphemy. So this is a problem for the credibility of Westerners, obviously, when they criticize Muslim countries for having blasphemy laws. At the same time, blasphemy laws are absolutely in retreat in the West. And UN human rights authorities have, over the last decade, landed on the conclusion that blasphemy laws against blasphemy are not compatible with the principle of freedom of expression. So I think the historical tide is going against blasphemy laws. But there are still countries hanging on to them. And as you said, laws against apostasy, that is, laws against leaving a religion, in this case the religion of Islam, are a fairly unique phenomenon for Muslim countries. And also blasphemy laws, which are not unique to Muslim countries, they tend to be practiced more harshly, to have harsher punishments. Although there are big differences between Muslim countries in this respect. So at the worst end, you have countries with the death penalty for blaspheming the Prophet. You have this in Pakistan, in Iran. So this is a particularly pressing problem in the Muslim, in Muslim majority societies. And this is also why, now we've been talking for a long time about Norway and perhaps what the kind of things that motivated me and my fellow Norwegians in this project to take part in it. But we have not in this project dealt at all really with these international incidents, with the incidents that have troubled Danish and Norwegian society, or with the Rushdie affair, or with the attack on the French cartoon newspaper Charlie Hebdo in 2015. These are not the things we are dealing with here. We are dealing with the problems internal to Muslim majority societies.
But of course, you also say that they have a direct, that there is, this is a speculation, which is I think very important for this project, that they have that the reform inside of these countries and inside of these judicial systems could have a large impact on of course also these international affairs.
Absolutely, and the converse is also true. The international debate, of course, has an effect on the debate in Muslim countries. And we don't really go into this much, but we note this polarization. On the one hand, in the West, and Norway would be an example, we now have blasphemy. We have sort of exalted blasphemy as a marker of what we are as a society, and as a loyalty marker that Muslim citizens have to be okay with. We have made the freedom of expression not just a legal right that is very important for us as citizens against the state, but we've also imagined it as a kind of core national value, something intrinsic to what it means to be one of us. And I think we have a polarization here where the opposite, where this is noticed in the Muslim world, and the opposite is happening in Muslim countries, that, of course, if if the imperialists are championing freedom of expression against the Prophet Muhammad, we will stand with the Prophet Muhammad.
This identity,
so
this kind of opposition.
So there's an identity politics going on here on both sides, I think. And to be clear, I mean, my position in this is a stance for international human rights, including the freedom of religion and the freedom of expression. And that is the spirit in which we enter into this project. But at the same time, you cannot ignore the context of this use of human rights as an identity marker, which I think is
has negative
detrimental, yes, to the debate.
There's a very interesting strategy actually of this project, because it is kind of there is an ideal of course some decisively Western values, but they find alliance within some currents of the Muslim tradition itself. What are those alliances?
So there is, well, Muslim tradition is, I mean, we have over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today, spread over the whole world, and a history going back to the 7th century, right? So it's an extremely internally diverse tradition, and it's a dynamic tradition. Forget the stereotypes about Muslims being stuck in the Middle Ages. I mean, it has been a constantly evolving tradition, although, like all traditions, with the idea that it shouldn't be evolving, that it should hold on to the that one has to hold on to the tradition and not deviate from it. But so there is a modern current of reformism within Islam. It has various names: modernism, reformism, engendered by the well, there were reformist currents within Islam before colonization, but it was, of course, the shock of colonization and of confrontation with Western modernity that spurred these various thinkers, like Muhammad Abduh in Egypt, to go back to the sources and rethink Islamic tradition. Is democracy actually an Islamic value? Should we reform the position? Should we reform the position of women, and so on? This reformist tradition has gone through various evolutions, and we have been fortunate to be able to work with a number of thinkers across the world, from Iran, from Indonesia, from Egypt, from Bosnia, from, I could go on, who deal with these questions in their context. And this, I think, is the strength of our project, that we are not coming from the outside, but we are just providing a platform for Muslim scholars and advocates to address the problems from within. So what are
those main insider strategies of this kind of reform that you are presenting on this platform? There is a hermeneutical one, and also a judicial one. What are the main focuses of this platform?
The way we have structured our work has been a kind of threefold thing. First, to go back to the historical tradition, to the construction of Islamic law and its concepts in history, and to question the understanding of Islamic law today, based on the fact that the tradition was at the time much more diverse. There were other voices, so it's a question of lifting these voices up, of noticing irregularities in the arguments, and asking if we were to discuss this again today. So, for example, in this book, we have one chapter dedicated to the interpretation of one single verse from the Quran, which today many Muslims today understand this verse as establishing freedom of religion. And so one reformist approach would be just to quote this verse and say Islam supports absolute freedom of religion, so we cannot have apostasy laws. We are trying to go deeper, so we have, for example, one chapter dealing with the history of interpretation of this verse, and how actually a few thinkers in the classical era of Islam looked into the question of for example, how religious faith could be coerced. I mean, it's not faith if you're forced to believe, right? And a few interpreters got into this, but at the same time, a kind of prevailing line of interpretation has been to sort of explain the verse away, saying that it dealt with a very specific situation at the time of the Prophet only, for example. So it's a question of lifting up again from tradition those voices that could present different solutions. Then in the structure, then after this sort of deconstruction of tradition, we look at the situation today. So one section of this book, for example, is dedicated to looking at how blasphemy and apostasy laws operate in selected Muslim countries today. The penal law of Iran, the prosecution of blasphemy in Egypt, the way fatwas are being used by the nominally secular state in Indonesia, for example, and the way the death penalty for blasphemy is being defended by its supporters in Pakistan. And then we go on to look at some new arguments for reform. So in this book, for example, we have an Iranian religious intellectual trained in the traditional seminars who argues for a complete end to the blasphemy, to the apostasy laws primarily, but he also argues against the blasphemy laws in Islam from the position of an expert on Shia Islamic law, and then of course you can you can question our approach, right? There are strategic pitfalls here. And there is a quite polarized debate within many Muslim societies between secularist reformers and the kind of people we are working with who are religious reformers. A lack of trust between these groups and a sterile debate sometimes. So you can question, I mean, should we be platforming the religious voices even more? Shouldn't we just be insisting on secular international human rights and on the separation of religion and state? But partly we think this sort of project can build bridges and move the debate ahead, and partly we just have to face the fact that that adherence to tradition is important for many people, that Islamic law informs many modern legislations. This was even more the case when we dealt with family law, which is where Muslim countries have preserved the most solutions from unwritten medieval Islamic law. But also in these cases, I mean, it's not uniquely Islamic. I mean, we see in this project how blasphemy laws have also been introduced actually by Western colonizers. The British introduced a blasphemy law when they ruled India.
So it's a complex process, right?
And the law we have in Pakistan today, the British colonial law still forms the kernel of the Pakistani penal law on blasphemy, but then under the influence of political Islam in the 70s and 80s, more offenses and harsher penalties were added.
But how strong is this opposition in the most crucial countries where these problems are most visible? I mean, for instance, your project, if I'm not mistaken, started around 2008.
We started this one in 2012.
But the whole New Directions
goes back to 2003, 2004.
2004. So, for instance, from the beginning of this New Directions project, were there any positive signs in these countries showing in the direction of the positive development or positive reform in your view, or is this more of a kind of a future slow process which is not showing many signs of progress right now?
Yes, we have had to ask ourselves that question, and I think that to some extent what we are doing is trying to build the argumentation, build the case, so that it can be used by reformers when the time is ripe, when there is a political opportunity for change. Certainly, when we started this, I don't think many things were looking as if they were going the right way. This was a few years after the 9/11 attacks. There were the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there was a surge, I think, of the worst forces of the kind of a very reactionary Islamist groups at this time. So I don't think we were going into this thinking that it would be an easy ride. And of course, some things went even worse after that. In the 2010s, we had the phenomenon of the Islamic State, the Caliphate in Iraq and Syria. This absolutely horrific para-state that seemed to exult in bringing back all the worst excesses of the darkest days. Who actually brought back slavery, sex slavery.
And probably the worst kinds of blasphemy and apostasy sanctions in modern history, right?
Well, of course, you would have been instantly beheaded for that.
Of course, yeah.
So, but there are here and there. I mean, things are happening. When we worked on family law, the previous book, a very important case was that of Morocco, which had a few years earlier comprehensively reformed its family law to try and strike a new balance between, on the one hand, Muslim views on the relation between spouses and shares of inheritance and so on, and on the other hand, Morocco's international obligations under international human rights conventions, under the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So that was a very important reform, which did not go as far as women's advocates would like, but which nevertheless made very important steps. So we had an analysis of that by a Moroccan legal expert with regard to freedom of expression, for example. One of the democracies that are still that came out of the Arab Spring, Tunisia, has introduced a law against charging people with apostasy. A law against the accusation of apostasy as a form of hate speech, if you like. This happened a few years ago, so there are some promising signs.
Yeah, but now if we look at the other side of the argument, the apologists in the Islamic world of the apostasy laws, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know a lot about these defenses, but when I've looked a bit into them, I saw there's a very common argument, very frequent argument, which has to deal with the accusation of hypocrisy of the West, hypocrisy of the West. Mainly in regards to the argument is usually saying that the apostasy is a certain mechanism in those society which has a similar parallel mechanisms in every stable society, but there's just these kinds of mechanisms are just based around different values than in Islam, for in their view, in Islamic law, around the true values, and in the West around some fake modern values which they deny. But for instance, one of the mechanisms that they talk about is high treason. They compare that to the apostasy laws, and it's interesting. What do you think about such apologies? What would be your argument against them?
Well, first of all, this is also a reformist argument, funnily enough. This idea that, so the death penalty for apostasy, which is part of Islamic law, but does not exist, for example, in the Quran. There is no verse of the Quran stating that you should kill people for leaving Islam. This has indeed been compared to high treason in the West, and the argument goes like this. At the beginning of Islam, the community of the first Muslims was besieged by their enemies in Mecca, and they barely survived. In this situation, the polity and the religion was one, and to leave the religion of the Prophet was also to go against the community and to make war against it, to support the enemy. And here is where the reformist argument comes in. You could not separate state and religion in the Prophet's Medina. But today we have separation between state and religion. So today, leaving religion and the high treason are two different things. And you can now treat conversion, change of religion, as a personal spiritual decision, and not as a political issue. Now, this argument has its limits, obviously. First of all, there are some states that have based their constitution on Islam and call themselves Islamic republics, like Iran. And these Islamist states do not support this separation of state and religion, obviously, so it's a harder argument to make there. You can argue for it as a kind of possible argument, but it's not how those states work. And also, this is quite a widespread argument, actually, and you find some of the more progressive Islamists really exploring it, but it often comes with some stipulations, like as long as they don't propagate their new religion or insult Islam after converting, then, according to this argument, we could accept to look at conversion as a personal decision, but so that's just a comment on this specific argument that you mentioned. But I think that, in some ways I agree with this broader argument as a structural thing, that obviously every society has certain values that it places above discussion. And there are different values that we make, I might even say, sacred. I mean, in the tradition of Durkheimian sociology of religion, the sacred is that which is protected by taboos, right? So anything our social norms say we cannot cannot talk about, cannot offend. That is the sacred value in that society.
Just the last question, what are maybe some of the next plans for the New Directions project? Are there any new volumes in sight, new research programs?
We are just starting up a new project on children's rights. So I don't have a lot to say about that yet, but stay tuned.
Looking forward to it. Christian Mu, thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.